And welcome to Next Level, a production of North Beach Community TV and Coastal Unity. I'm Dave Haviland, your host tonight, and our topic is the prison industrial complex. On my right, we have, to my far right, Marianne Hopkins Everson.
Hello, I'm a nurse and a community organizer, and I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
To my immediate right, Dr. Doreen Hardin-Cato.
Hi. My background, I've had 15-20 years working with ex-felons, families, and youth.
And to my immediate left, Felicia Mullins.
Hello, I'm a social media influencer, and I also am the founder of Sustain Our Ratio.
And we're joined via Skype by our special guest, Dr. Kevin Gannon, the tattooed professor. He's the director of the Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning, and the author of the documentary 13. Thank you for joining us. Tell us a little bit about your program.
Sure. I direct a Center for Excellence in Teaching and Learning here at Grandview University, and I also teach in our history department, so it gives me a chance to really keep a foot in both worlds that I'm very interested in, which is United States history and history of the Americas, as well as teaching and learning, and in particular, we do a lot of work with inclusive and multicultural teaching and learning, social justice informed sort of pedagogy. We are a university that values access to higher education, works with a diverse array of students, so that's a real priority for us, and it matches very closely my scholarly interests as well. I have an interest, I do research, writing, and speaking in race in United States history, in particular the ways that race and racism have intersected with our history and with Americans in this, I guess you could call it, very contested debate over who is an American or what it means to be an American. It's a question that I find fascinating, and I find very fascinating the ways in which we've tried to answer that over our history.
So tell us a little bit about the documentary 13.
Well, it was sort of serendipitous, the way I became involved in it. It was through a social media connection and some writing that I'd done online, in particular about the relationship between slavery and the United States Constitution. A piece I wrote had kind of made the rounds via the blogosphere and especially Twitter, where I'm very active. And once the piece had kind of gotten out there, I got a message from Ava DuVernay's personal assistant who said, we're working on a project that ties very closely into some of the things that you're writing about, and they were wondering if I'd be interested in being interviewed for it, to which my response was, yeah, absolutely. And that was how I got involved in the project. It's been amazing to have been a part of that documentary, to appear alongside some of the figures, the scholars, the activists for whom I just have so much admiration and respect. So for me personally, that was an amazing part of it. But just the way that the documentary has really used its platform to bring these issues to the forefront of our national conversation. I think probably the most rewarding aspect of it for me is I get emails and tweets and Facebook messages from college students throughout the country who are either watching it on their own or as part of a class assignment, were moved by the story and the evidence that 13th puts in front of us, and find me on the internet and reach out to say just how powerful they found it and how can we get involved and work to rectify these issues, what can we do now. And so for me, as a college faculty member, to see students and members of college communities connect with the film like that has been, it really just affirms my optimism and my faith that we can, if we have the resolve, work through and hopefully resolve some of these extremely thorny issues, kind of untie some of the knots that have bound us throughout our history.
It does go deep into our history, and it certainly is different in many states, and it's going to take quite a bit to untangle, as you say. So our guests have a few different questions. We go ahead and make their rounds. Marianne, did you want to have a question? Do you have a question?
Well, you talked about encouraging young people and how encouraged you are by them coming to you. What are some ways that you suggest that other people, or some ways that you've been successful in encouraging younger people to become more involved and have, show their voice?
Well, there's a number of things I think we can do, but a lot of it comes down to the individual decision to empower ourselves and to be empowered in various situations we find ourselves in the community, in the classroom. We can't just be bystanders to our own society. We can't be bystanders as structures of inequality continue to be built and expanded upon us. So I think, what I try to convey to students is to take ownership of your education, find ways for your learning to intersect with the needs of the world. That's what they talk about when we talk about vocation, right? Where do your passions and your commitments intersect with the needs of the world, the needs of the communities around us? And, obviously I'm a history professor, so I'm a little biased, but a deeper understanding of our history, how we got from there to here, none of this stuff appeared out of a vacuum. Structures of inequality aren't built overnight, and nor are they dismantled overnight. I think a lot of times we get discouraged when we don't see immediate tangible results from getting involved in a movement for change. But deep-seated change is addressing deep-seated problems. So you can't just uproot the whole thing overnight. So an understanding of history to understand the need for our sustained commitment, for not losing hope even when that sort of first initial rush of a commitment to activism wears off. We need to have something to sustain us beyond that.
Thank you.
Well, my question has to do with, when you said slavery and Constitution, it really got my eyebrow going up. And
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you. Could you speak up a little bit,
when you
please?
spoke about slavery and Constitution, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to make sure. It made my eyebrow arch because I'm looking at the parallelism of the war on drugs and the increase of the incarceration of people of color, especially African Americans. And how do you see do you see the Constitution itself making a significant impact on that particular situation?
Well, that's a complex question. I think we can answer in a number of ways. But I'll observe this. The chief of staff for the current administration's comments in the last couple of days about the American Civil War being the product of our inability to compromise. That strikes me as just how we as a society still have to reckon with the fact that this country, in terms of the government we live under, the constitutional republic that was created in 1787, was the product of compromise. Compromise over slavery. That is the actively made decision to trade the rights of the enslaved and the recognition of enslaved people's humanity to achieve a political union and the ratification of the Constitution. The founding fathers, as we call them, they made no bones about that in their deliberations of the Constitutional Convention. So we have a structure of government that was fundamentally born out of a compromise with slavery, a decision that was willingly made, not forced upon anyone, to trade one thing for another. And we need to own that. We need to recognize that we don't want to talk about it as a society because it's a pretty stark truth, but we can't make any headway until we acknowledge that part of our history, because this explains to us this fundamental willingness to compromise over the issues of slavery and freedom, to literally create the land of the free in the same place that you have the home of the slave. You can't understand the sweep of U.S. history without understanding that sort of bedrock principle. So when we look at the way in which slavery was enforced, and then after the Civil War, the ways in which African Americans found themselves in what Douglas Blackman called slavery by another name, there have always been aspects of our state system, that is the way that our government apparatus is built and operated, the way that laws are implemented. There has always been an aspect of racial inequality. It's baked into the cake. It's part of the historical development of the United States. And our refusal to reckon with that is a way that we've been unable to reckon with genuine, thoroughgoing solutions. It's a systemic problem. You can't put a Band-Aid on it. So I think the best example that we could look at today is the way that the opioid epidemic is being treated as a public health crisis and an emphasis on funding for treatment, for counseling, and things of that nature, versus the way that we looked at the crack epidemic of the 1980s, which was treated by a ramping up of incarceration and punitive measures. And the opioid epidemic is something that affects, at least in the public eye, a majority whites. The crack epidemic was something that happened in African American areas, especially urban areas of the country. It is very clear that this double standard still exists. Mm-hmm. So if we're going to talk about living under a constitutional system, we have to reckon with the fact that our Constitution was conceived in inequality and then has been implemented unequally since. We have the power to change that. We have the power to implement laws fully. We just have to grasp that power as a society, and we haven't done so yet.
I think you bring up a really interesting point about narrative, especially when you talk about the opioid epidemic and how it seems many affected individuals are seen as patients and victims, whereas the crack epidemic, a lot of those affected individuals were seen more as criminals. In that sense, in considering narrative and narrative as helping to change culture, what are ways that we can change the narrative around, not only around drugs, but the narrative around the prison system and individuals who are incarcerated at higher rates and such?
Well, again, a really complex question, but I think a lot of the answer comes down to people who look like me, people who identify and are identified as white. Because whites in the United States are able to fall into this narrative trap where we are seen as the norm and everything else is the deviation from. So, the question we deal with in education, right? How come all the black kids are sitting together in the cafeteria? Well, what if we flip that around and say, well, why are all the white kids sitting together in the cafeteria? Even more of an issue, but no one talks about it that way, because to be non-white is to be seen in some ways as pathological, right? So white opioid addicts are addicted people or patients. Black crack addicts are criminals or predators. So I think a lot of the responsibility for undoing this narrative is for the people who benefit from that narrative to do that work, to call it out. We need to be critical consumers of information. We can't just accept media portraits of our society as the way things are, and we need to take the responsibility to call that out when we see it, to push back against when people talk about, the real problem in the country is black on black crime. Well, really, because white on white crime is even more of a problem if you look at statistics. So let's push back against some of those easy, lazy assumptions and undo that narrative. Narratives don't undo themselves. Stories don't not tell themselves. People are telling stories. If those stories continue to persist, then we need to ask ourselves why that is. And in most cases, it's because of this tacit acceptance from people who might otherwise have the power to challenge those, to poke holes in what is a myth, a false narrative. And I think that people who identify as white really need to be doing that work much more strongly, much more consistently.
Mm-hmm.
My question, I would like to preface a little. Different states deal with their prison systems differently, and fund their prison systems differently. And many states are underfunded and incentivizing privatization or incentivizing alternative solutions. I'm just kind of curious, in your experience, who is better at the wheel, if it's privatization or state run, and is either system going to get us away from this or just closer to it, because cheaper is more efficient is maybe more stereotypical?
Well, I think that nothing good has come out of the prison privatization initiatives. When you incentivize incarceration of people, you are basically guaranteed people will be incarcerated. A lot of these state contracts, for example, have minimum bed numbers that these facilities will house. You will give us X amount of inmates so we can continue to charge in terms of healthcare, meals, and things like that. So there's a guaranteed floor to a lot of these contracts. So you're incentivizing the bringing in of people into the mass incarceration system. So attaching the profit motive to incarceration seems to me to be a really bad idea. It also opens the door to all sorts of abuses. In 13th, we talk about, we point out the ways that violence within prisons, the Khalif Browder tragic story is only one of the most visible cases of what happens on an everyday level. There have been stories in the news recently and stretching back several decades about just the abysmal health care or lack thereof that's provided to inmates. So this idea that we can more efficiently accomplish something by privatizing it, the facts do not bear that out. The profits to these private prison companies, of course, have gone through the roof. But I think the larger problem that we have is we haven't had a conversation in this country about what the goal is for incarceration. Because we talk about, the word, penitentiary, the original name for prisons, comes from the same root word for penitence. The idea was that when we started to see penitentiaries constructed in the early 1800s in the United States, the idea was to reform the criminal to return to society after their transgressions. So how does one do their penitence and be reformed? Well, our system of incarceration is incredibly punitive. It functions arbitrarily. It's more a product of how much wealth you have and what resources you can access than it is about, any particular crime that one may or may not have committed. Almost 100% of cases in some areas are plea bargained before they even go to trial. So we have decided to lock people up as punishment, but we don't really have anything beyond that. So I think the model we need to look at is, prison abolition and a restructuring of our system along the lines of what the Scandinavian countries, the Nordic countries are doing, in particular Norway. I think there are effective models for societies that are as industrialized and have population density that is at least at the same tier as ours. But I think a radical restructuring is the only answer at this point to what has developed to be an extraordinarily broken system.
Dr. Kevin Gannon, thanks again so much for joining us today. Now, if folks want to get more information, they can obviously look up the documentary 13 on YouTube. Are there any other websites or anything you'd like to direct people to?
Well, I just would urge people to go on Netflix, watch 13th, and then several college faculty have put together syllabi and reading lists that go along with the documentary. So if you were to do a Google search for 13th syllabus, you'll find a way to get connected with some of the work that the scholars have done who are associated with the film and resources that you could broaden your inquiry and get involved.
Thank you so much again, Doctor, for joining us.
No, thanks for having me. It was a pleasure.
Again, this is Next Level, production of North Beach Community TV and Coastal Unity. And I guess if you want to kind of make the rounds and tell us what you take away from that.
Well, for me, it was a reiteration of watching the movie. It kind of gave us some bullet points to think about and do for our community, things to think about and bring here, and try to make a more of a movement. The biggest thing personally that I took from it is something that I thought of before. I need to use my privilege. I need to use my white privilege to voice out this, human indignity that we are dealing with right now. It's absolutely feel that that's my responsibility as a person in this community.
And squash some of those common misconceptions
Absolutely.
that we kind of maybe let slip because, they're said so often and you just don't think about it.
And sometimes you feel uncomfortable, telling someone that you don't agree with them. It's an uncomfortable situation to be in, but it's necessary. It's necessary.
Very much so.
Dr. Kano?
Yeah, he said so much in that short space of time that it really made an impact on me. One of the things that come to me is, and I've seen throughout the 20 years I've worked with folks who were incarcerated and trying to get back into society, and that is how much we prevent them from getting back into society. And there's such a high percentage that goes back into prison because of that. And what comes to mind is that we have people who are supposed to be reformed before they get out, and majority of them are not. And they're, number one, the impact and trauma of coming back, if you've been gone a while, trying to get back into it, even though you do have people going into the prison and telling them what's going on, it's still not the same as entering it. And so the biggest piece, and I wanted to ask him this question, is that how people who do come out of the system, the pursuit of happiness. And I've heard that from an ex-felon. He said, how is that being defined? Because I can't drive, can't vote, can't get housing, difficult to find work. So how is that the pursuit of happiness?
Right.
You know, and when my mouth was open when he said that, because it was difficult for me to answer, because I saw it. I saw what he was talking about. And I think that's something that needs to be addressed.
Well, certainly something that doesn't encourage the recidivism numbers that we see.
Exactly.
Well, I want to kind of add to that because what's interesting when we're talking about narrative of the prison industrial complex and we're talking about felons, ex-felons and offenders being reintroduced into society, coming into society. One of the things that we don't talk about, one of the stories is an economic one, and how it's something like in 2014, the GDP lost I think it was between 78 billion and 86 billion dollars because ex-offenders weren't able to find work.
That's right.
And so I think for all of us, for our entire community, if we don't find ways to help offenders or even talk about offenders coming into society, it affects the tax base, it affects our economy, it affects our economic well-being, our pursuit of happiness as a nation.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Well, it's a good point to make because not only are they, utilizing the services of the system,
Right.
That's costing the average taxpayer, but then by not contributing, it's also overall costing.
Correct.
I want to address something Mariana had said, because you said something that's very, very powerful, and that is being able to use your white privilege. Now, a lot of people don't even know what that means, because people are still...
A lot of people don't acknowledge it.
Right,
They
well,
just don't see it.
well, sometimes people keep addressing privilege itself to wealth, not
Right.
versus the way Mariana's talking about it. And that is being able to enter a door and I can't go behind you. That kind of privilege. And I have heard people here in this county that have said to me, we're the cause of the division. Talking African Americans are the cause of the division in this country. And I said, what? How? I said, the division has always been there. It never left.
That's right.
And however, I said, we need to start talking to each other, because it's not knowing the history that we carry versus the history we were taught in schools.
That's right.
Yeah, so I just want you to speak, if you don't mind, just a little bit
About
about that.
okay, well, I've always felt myself no different than anyone else, but I didn't know a lot of people who were different than me. Does that make sense? So when I got grown up and I went to college, or I moved to a new city and met new people, then I learned more. And I've always been outraged by the fact that there's inequality, no matter if it's racial or economic or any inequality. That always has outraged me. And I think that it's important as citizens of the United States of America, as people that live here, that benefit from the privileges that we all have, because there are some privileges that we all have. It is our responsibility to not only move forward, but to pull someone else with you, and reach up, and it's absolute, just a fundamental responsibility of everyone to do that. And it angers me and outrages me that there is a such thing as a white privilege, but I'm willing to acknowledge that and do whatever has to be done to use that to make it better for someone else.
Okay. have about 5 minutes left. Any closing statements? Anything else that taken away?
Well, I appreciate this conversation. I think really it comes down to cultural change. Of course, Dr. Gannon talked a lot about the impact of, not the impact, but how the Constitution has been kind of used to create an inequality in a lot of ways. Even though it's a document that is it's totally about equality. So I think it really does come down to values. I think it comes down to being able to talk to people coming together and overcoming their differences, and really coming to an understanding of what kind of values they share. Because when it comes to the prison population and how it is damaging communities and children, entire generations of people, that it's unsustainable. It truly is. And so I think values is critical, for sure.
I've seen it firsthand in many different ways. Not enough time to tell a long story, but this has to do with the youth. And a first timer, granted what she did, she shouldn't have done. We had to acknowledge that, and that had to do with stealing an item at a store. Her mistake was when the security guard tried to reach for her after they got out the door, she instinctively turned and hit her. Big mistake. But the other thing was how the justice system went after her. First time, never ever committed a crime. Yet she was assigned to a lawyer who had too many dockets, who had little inclination, and to him she was guilty. And they were going to charge her with 2 felonies, which could have had 6 months imprisonment, as well as restitution. I fought for her. Went every day, not every day, but every time she had to go to court. And I talked to him sternly because I let him know I was watching. And we were able to get one reduced, and the other we couldn't. I mean, we reduced it to from the severity. One we got off completely. You know, if I wasn't there to fight for her, she would have been doing time for stealing one item. But her mistake, like I said, was hitting that security guard, and she wouldn't drop the charge.
Well, and back to that topic, she would have been learning how to bounce back in and out of the system.
Exactly.
That's what she would have been learning from
Right.
the system, is how to get
And the
back
part
in.
that I was upset about, she was African American for one, but there was a white teenager who committed even more of a crime, and he was let off. You know, so you see things like that, the unfairness in a system, and that's about social justice. And I believe all of us can have a commitment to help, especially when it's youth. They don't have to go in that direction.
Right.
So it's more about how can we do it. Set aside our thoughts about racism or the who's did this and whose fault it is, but help those that's coming through, because they are our legacy. I'm off my soapbox.
Well, I'll build on what Dr. Cato said, and some of what I was saying earlier. I think that we need to destroy the thought process that it's only about me. That it's only about me. Like, oh well, that happened to her, but I got off. But she, it doesn't affect me because I'm okay. Well, it will affect you, because if they come for one, they'll come for us all. And if we don't come together now, then we're not going to get the change that we need. Because anybody who's not making billions of dollars is out of the club, and we're not in the club, and so we got to make our own club. We got to make our own club.
Okay, well, again, thanks again for joining us, and it's been Next Level, production of Northeast Community TV and Coastal Unity. I'm Dave Haviland, Marianne Hopkins-Everson, thank you, Dr. Doreen Hardin-Cato, and Felicia Mullins.
Thank you.
Thank you.